Thank you all for coming. That's unexpected. You know, it was 2 days ago, and the turnout is amazing, especially on Saturday. That's quite impressive, and we also have the little ones. First, probably political meetings. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. That's our second event, and we try to do that together with a Palestinian group. Thank you for helping as well. And today we have the chance to have two lecturers, Dr. Branwen Spector and Ieva, I have to read it, Ieva Koreivaite, right? All right. So we're going to talk about the architecture of the occupation. So that's one of the most striking things when we travel in the West Bank. I guess most of us have not been in Gaza, so we don't really know how it goes there, but we have an idea. So we'll be focusing more on the architecture of the occupation. So we'll have a global, an overview of what it is, what is settler colonialism, the impact on the infrastructures and buildings and so on. And then we get more into details with Dr. Branwen Spector. So please start with settler colonialism, architecture of the occupation. Just give us an overview of it, please.
Okay. Of course, like Palestinian resistance is based on the idea of sovereignty, which was developed already in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. But it's also, I guess, is based on the experience of occupational infrastructures, which are both visual and not visual. And we can speak about social infrastructures, cultural infrastructures, and even resources based on infrastructures of developing and dividing the resources, and also visual infrastructures like architectural infrastructures of the colonialism and the settler colonialism and general occupation. And I guess we can speak not only about the West Bank, also about the Gaza Strip. The Israeli narrative, main narrative, is denying the occupation of the Gaza, but like the Gaza airspace and waters and borders are controlled by Israel. So I think we can speak about the occupation. And actually, if we try to examine this architectural infrastructure in the timeline, we can see that after the war of 1967, there was a clear fortification of ceasefire lines, and also their fragmentation after 1973 conflict, and also we saw this construction of hilltop settlements and the whole techno-political development since 1993, it's Oslo Accords. Then the whole checkpoint system was developed, and also later on in 2005, Israeli withdrew from the Gaza Strip, and what was the fate of these vacated settlement buildings, and finally militarization of the airspace above Gaza. So there is a very clear timeline how this colonial or even occupational infrastructure was developed, and how it was fortified or how it was fragmentized. But for me it was very interesting. Recently I was reading one study written by Weizmann, and the book is called Hollow Land, Israel's Architecture of Occupation, and there he gives the logics of verticalization. So he presents in general three-dimensional understanding of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And in general he speaks that, okay, so there are Israeli military officers who do use 3D computer models to devise tactics for moving inside West Bank occupied cities or urban spaces. And then there are Palestinians who do dig beneath the borders, and also they do launch missiles above the borders. So when we don't have in general the map of the conflict is not this like conventional map that we do have is two-dimensional map, but here we do have like an architectural model, 3D model of the whole occupational infrastructure that do include tunnels, then borders, and also roads system, the whole infrastructure, and also the infrastructure of Iron Dome and the launching systems. So we have like the whole 3D model of this occupational architecture. And for me it was very interesting to understand that like EDF, they did have a think tank which was called Operational Theory Research Institute, now it's dismantled. And they employed philosophers and political scientists who were working on expansion of a notion of a space. So in general, what we were doing, they introduced new operative protocols during attacks of West Bank cities, and they were trying to avoid exposed external spaces like streets on alleys, and we were trying, for example, to move. We were moving into the domestic space by punching holes in the walls, also in the ceilings and in the floors. So that's how they tried to counter the resistance from above and from the below, like physically, in general, moving differently inside the space. And for me, it was like really stunning to understand that even like IDF officers, how they described this urban warfare. It was stunning because of sophistication of language, because like we were using such language like inverse geometry, the reorganization of the urban syntax, and the stretching the boundaries of spatial interpretation. This is the language of warfare. So that was crucially interesting for me. So in general, what I'm trying to say that this kind of occupational infrastructure is highly developed, and some of this architecture is visible, and even when it is visible, even it's very complex. It's like a 3D model, and also, of course, I think we have to speak about not visible infrastructure. And speaking about just the figures, that during 2023, 948 Palestinian-owned structures have been demolished or seized by Israeli government authorities. So in 1 year, and 1,678 Palestinians, so we're just speaking about the West Bank, they are displaced. And that we know very well that in general, Israeli government has established a two-tier legal and political system that provides comprehensive rights for the Jewish Israeli settlers while imposing military rule and control over Palestinians. And and actually I would like to speak much more, and because for me it was really interesting to read about how in general these settler colonies, settlements are built, how we are constructing like panopticon, but I'm not sure if I'm going to refer to these issues. If not, yeah, so let's continue later.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so.
So hi everyone, it's nice to be here. I am an anthropologist, so I will try to talk with some more detail about infrastructure, but it's easier for me to do that by telling about stories of people I know. So I was very lucky to spend 3 years in the West Bank, from 2015 to 2018, doing research. And I work among both Palestinian refugees and the Israeli settlers. And I'm very interested in how people ended up in the West Bank and how they move around inside the West Bank. I think we talk about Palestinians very often as immobilized by the occupation, and something I found really interesting when I was there was that actually they're very mobile, and that if we can, we should try to think of them also as not just this static trapped mass. They are trapped, but they still live active and full holistic lives. And interestingly, the something I didn't expect, and kind of one of the main things I learned about the settlers is that they consider themselves trapped, and they consider themselves immobilized by the presence of Palestinians who they live very close to. And that's led me to be very interested in the infrastructure and what are the ways that people can be mobile in the space. So I focus mostly on road and internet infrastructures. And this A.L. Wiseman's book that you mentioned, it's great. I really think it's helpful in understanding the three-dimensionality of the space, which is nice to think about apartheid because of the way that Palestinians and the occupiers go over and around and underneath each other. But also it fits very nicely with the topography of the West Bank region, which is very hilly. It's very beautiful. So it's easy in a way to kind of use the hills and the valleys to kind of play out this urban and rural kind of warfare tactics that the occupation has designed. So maybe what I can do is to tell a story about road use of a friend of mine to kind of explain this 3D logic of the roads and what it's like just to try and move around in the West Bank. So the friend of mine, I'll talk about it, he's called Kusai, he's a very good friend, and he's a refugee living in a refugee camp in Bethlehem city. And his sister, he's one of 12 brothers and sisters, and one of his sisters got married, lives in a village nearby. It's about 8 kilometers away. It should take like 20 minutes to drive there, right? Number one, you can't use Google Maps if you're Palestinian. So the intersection of digital and road infrastructures is already unusual in Palestine. You can use Google Maps if you are Israeli. Why? Because you're routing from an Israeli space, a settlement, probably inside historic Palestine or Israel. So if you want to go from a settlement to Jerusalem, you put it into Google Maps or Waze or whatever you want to use, and it will show you the way. Palestinians cannot route between their areas. Of course, they know the way anyway, so they don't need to look up the route. If you're a foreigner like me, it would be very helpful to have a map, but you have to guess and just experiment. So I also know the roads very well from just driving and seeing what happens. So to go to his sister's village, you have like 3 options. You can take the main highway. It's called Road 60. It's called also it's called the Hebron-Jerusalem Road. It's actually also known as the Path of the Patriarchs. It's a really ancient road that goes from Nazareth city in the north right down to Beersheba in the south, and now it's been cut and blocked because of the wall around the West Bank. And then after the Second Intifada, the Israelis removed the road. It used to pass through Bethlehem from Jerusalem to Hebron, connecting these 3 holy cities. But because of the policies of segregation, the road was moved outside of Bethlehem. So now it's a big highway that goes around the outside. It's a rare section of the road that Palestinians can use. Palestinians can't use a lot of the roads. They're closed for Palestinian use, and they only connect historic Palestine or Israel with the settlement. So if you want to pass on this road and you're Palestinian, so you're carrying a Palestinian West Bank ID card, it's not possible because there is a checkpoint which it's not allowed to pass. I could pass it, and sometimes we would pass it because I'm white and people tend to think I was Israeli. The soldiers don't pay too much attention, but it's risky for both of us, right? I can either get kicked out, and for a Palestinian, they can be put in jail immediately. So we would make this journey very regularly to go and pick up his sister, to visit, to bring her back to the camp, to see her family, or to take her shopping. So we had this discussion a lot. What's the best route? Should we risk the checkpoint? That's option 1. Then option 2 is where it starts to get very 3-dimensional, is you can take an old Palestinian road that actually goes underneath this new highway. So it's a very bad road. It's very bumpy. It's not maintained. Palestinians are not allowed to build new infrastructures or especially new roads. They didn't have permission from the occupying government. So it's a bad road. And it's also a risky road because you have 2 kinds of checkpoints that control people's movement and use of infrastructure in the West Bank. You have these permanent ones that are part of the kind of landscape now. They're concrete posts, they're terminals, they're built to be part of the environment, and they're to stop Palestinians entering what you might call the border. It's not really the border, but to entering into Jerusalem and historic Palestine. This road then is, Palestinian roads are also subject to flying checkpoints, which are just some soldiers show up in a jeep, they put spikes in the road, and they're checking the ID cards of everybody who passes. You can get past, but the aim is also to scare you if you are at risk, which most Palestinians are particularly young men, especially my friend Kusai, who, like most Palestinian refugees, had spent time already in jail for taking part in resistance. So we don't really want to pass with the flying checkpoint. If we can avoid it, it adds half an hour to your journey. It becomes very tense. It's very annoying. So already now, thinking about these 2 options, we drove to this underpass road. We're about half an hour into our journey now. We see this checkpoint, and Palestinians will also warn you. They flash their lights in the road. They have hand gestures. So you learn these ways of traveling and using the space. So we see there is a flying checkpoint. Car is out of gas at this point, right? Gas is the most expensive in the occupied territories of all the countries in the Middle East. It's most expensive in Israel, right? So this is costing you now, trying all these different routes. So then the third option is to you take another approach to the same highway, but because the highway is not designed for Palestinians to use, you have to cross the city just to get a little bit further down the highway, if you can imagine. It's hard to understand without maps, but there are no maps of this as well. So then, now you're 45 minutes, you're $20 down because you had to buy gas, and we're on this Israeli-built highway that Palestinians are allowed to use this small part of. It's great, it's a nice highway, it's new, it's a fancy road, it doesn't damage the car like the bad roads do, but it's in Area C. So, this is the third problem of trying to use Palestinian infrastructure, is you need to know which area you're in. The West Bank is divided into 3 zones. You have Area A, that's the big Palestinian cities like Ramallah, Hebron, Bethlehem, Tulkarem, Jenin. And then you have Area B. Those cities make up about 18% of the West Bank. These numbers are always changing because the occupation expands. Area B is kind of shared industrial use. It's not really, it's about 6%, I think, of the whole of the West Bank. And then you have Area C, which is probably now about 80%. That's under the Israeli control. Area A is under the Palestinian control, which is de facto under the Israeli control, but in terms of governance and police, that's for the Palestinian control. Area C, so 80% of the West Bank, it's under the Israeli control. Palestinian police are not allowed there, and it shifts your subjectivity as a person, right? If you're in Palestinian areas, you're not safe, but you're safer. If you're a Palestinian in Area C, so you're moving between cities, you're driving outside of the main cities, you're going to villages. Many, many Palestinian villages are inside this Area C. You're at risk, more at risk, right? If you get in a car crash, if a settler decides to start an aggression with you, which is very common, if you're much more vulnerable, right, as a Palestinian. But it makes your journeys much quicker to use these new highways. So we take this road. It takes us approximately 1/3 of the way to his sister's village. Then you have to come off this new highway and back onto another old Palestinian road that runs exactly parallel to the Israeli road. So you really get this apartheid system. The Israeli road is covered in a high fence to protect it from stone throwing, from anything, but it's also not allowed for Palestinians to use it. There's no way of knowing that. There are no signs that say no Palestinians here. The Israelis are careful, right? It's not quite like South Africa where there are very clear signs that say no Arabs, no Palestinians. You just have to know that. And the only way you can know that is by trial and error. Palestinians, they know, they learn very quickly which roads they can't use. So from there, coming off the good road onto the bad road, it's added another 30 minutes to the journey. We can finally arrive at his sister's house. Now we did this journey at least 2 times a week. Imagine how many different other journeys of the same kind, people coming from the villages every day to the city to work, are having to experiment. Every time you leave the house, you have to find a way to know which is the best route to use, which one is going to have a checkpoint. Most of the time you call people or you just look on the roads. The topography then of the West Bank is helpful. You can drive up to the top of a hill and look at the different routes and see what's happening on them. But it's like attacks, right? This is one of the more structural forms of violence in the West Bank, is just the tax of your time, the tax of your money, and the tax of the kind of emotional impact of all of this. That it's this very regular reminder for people like my friend Kasai that you don't have the right just to go to see your family. We can take that from you. You don't have the right to have an easy journey to work or to university or to school or to pray or to see your family. To do anything, you understand that it's risky and something can go wrong, and it does. So that's more about the roads. I don't know. What else can we talk about that will be helpful?
Okay, so like at least for me it was interesting to understand about like how the settlements are built in general. Like I was also reading in the same book. I'm not a specialist in the infrastructure in the West Bank, but I was reading in the same book, and it looked real interesting that architecture of layout of the settlements, they are built in like kind of ring structure that in general every house has a living room with a window having the best view, but it's more complex because in general what they are looking at the valleys where Palestinians do live, so it's some kind of control and also like in general, gaze at the enemy. And it was for me quite interesting that this kind of that it evokes actually the image of a panopticon by Michel Foucault. Might be you heard about that. It's like a prison, which is based on the idea of the effect of the gaze. So in general, the settlers in this way, they do become some kind of gods. Or we can call them, but they do try to discipline Palestinians by gazing at them. So I'm not sure if you know this model of Michel Foucault. It's a kind of circular prison that there is like the guard or someone who observes the prisoners, and the prisoners, while knowing that they are observed, they become disciplined. So it's a very specific structure, and in general, these settlements that usually are built on the hilltops, they might be equated to this kind of idea of panopticon, of looking at someone who is an enemy. So, but in this case, it's also, we have to understand that these settlements, they became some kind of weapons. Weapons of in this conflict between Israel and Palestine. So for me, it was a very interesting idea, and maybe you can comment more about the settlements, how they are built and how they're operating.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sure. Yes, it's one of the strangest things about the settlements, and one of perhaps the most important things is they look all exactly the same. It's very deliberate policy that there is like one blueprint for the settlements, how they should be laid out and how they should look aesthetically. And that is repeated across the West Bank. First of all the settlements are, you're right, at the top of the hill. It's a defensive strategy that they can always see this enemy coming. And when you talk to settlers, and when I was meeting with the kind of administrators of the particular settlement that I focused on, there is this sense of the Arab rebellion is about to arrive. On one hand, that's part of Israeli history, right? It's twice before Arab armies have arrived en masse to go to war with Israel. On the other hand, there's no sense of responsibility for the provocation that is the building of the settlements. That they are built deliberately next to and around Palestinian areas, cities. Bethlehem city is surrounded by settlements, and it's intentional. It's to undo the idea of a potential for a one-state solution. But it's also a provocation. It's to close access for these Palestinian villages, so you get in or cities, so that you get in these situations where you have to go underneath or above, or just to prevent any Palestinian expansion. So there's that. The settlements are also visually, intentionally distinct from Palestinian spaces. So when you move through the West Bank, you can see very quickly what you're looking at. The settlements all have red roofs. They are nice villas, very new. Built in this what's called Jerusalem stone. I think it comes from Hebron more likely, but it's called Jerusalem stone. It is the law that they have to look exactly the same. Then within the settlements, they're very nice. They're very nice places to be. There's a lot of green space. They're built in a very spacious way. Every house is a nice villa with a nice garden. All of the streets are cul-de-sacs, so all the streets are closed, most of them at the end. It creates nice space for children to play, right, to feel safe, but it's also for the military strategy that if they are attacked, then they can retreat all into the middle. But it also makes the space very uniform and quite confusing. You know, there are people who joke like, if you're drunk, it's really hard to find your house coming home late at night, or even the right settlement, because they all look exactly the same. So it's this. There is also, a case for an argument against settlements because it doesn't blend and it doesn't reflect the kind of environment and the history and the space that they're in, that it's this kind of new imposition on the landscape that doesn't reflect traditional ways of building. The Arabic word for settler is mustawtan, which translates as like the one who tries to force his homeland. It's the illegitimate creation of the homeland, and you really feel this way in the settlements because they look like American suburbs, really. It's very like picturesque and perfect, but it doesn't feel like you're in the Middle East, right? So it's aesthetically a very strange place to be. And it's very interesting, it was very interesting to me that they're built so close to Palestinian spaces as well, because at best the settlers don't know Palestinians, they don't particularly like Palestinians, and they're making, whether they admit it or not, quite a provocative political choice by living in these settlements. Settlements have only been being built since the 70s and really denationalized and turned into these kind of suburbs since the 80s. So now we're only just looking at the kind of second generation of people who are born, the first generation of people born in the settlements are just kind of growing up now. So for their parents who chose to cross the Green Line and who chose to come and settle and occupy inside the West Bank, something that's really interesting to think about is why do you want to live against your enemy, or this thing that you don't like, this Palestinian kind of threat that you're afraid of? And Israeli cognitive dissonance is like prevalent and hard to understand, right? I think there are many choices that they make and kind of decisions about their lives that they make where they don't have the same logics of understanding occupation that perhaps we from outside do. And so when I would ask them, we're looking out of your window and we're looking into a Palestinian village or a town, or you can see this refugee camp in the distance, and what do you think about that? I would get one of two answers. The first one was, oh, they'll be gone soon, that they don't see Palestinians as permanent. They either see them, some people thought that Palestinians are labor migrants from Jordan or from Syria or from Iraq who came in 1967 to work. So they really don't even acknowledge the idea of a Palestinian nationality and ethnicity and group who have some claim to the land, who preceded the Jewish presence. Or they say, oh, those are good Palestinians. So it was this idea of your neighbor, the Palestinian, he's okay. And that was really surprising to me. Like, people, I would say, if they went to maybe a settlement in the north or to visit family or friends away from their own kind of area or region of the West Bank, people would say, oh, that's dangerous because you don't know those Palestinians and they don't know you. Particularly because of the labor relations of Palestinians, people have a sense that they employ Palestinians as construction workers, or Palestinians work in their supermarkets and their gas stations particularly. So there's this sense that the local and that even they might be friends with locals. And they would say things to me like, oh, I have a Palestinian guy who's building my basement or building my swimming pool, and he's great. He says, we love Israel and we want to live under Israeli rule. Of course they're going to say that when they're in your house and, under your control and employed by you, and all Palestinian laborers have to come with armed security. So, there's no sense of the power imbalance there. But it does remain very, if nothing else, aesthetically surprising that people want to live so close to this enemy. But there's this sense of kind of temporariness to Palestinians, at least among the settlers I met, that they will eventually just be compelled to leave, like the Israeli imagination is of the Nakba. Like, oh, they will go to another Arab country. It's kind of what we see now happening in Gaza. Like, oh, well, Egypt can take them or Jordan can take them, but they can't stay here.
And one of the most interesting experiences that you can go through the West Bank and not notice anything. It's like anyone can go and will be wondering, so there's nothing going on here. And one of the most interesting articles I read from Jeff Harper, Israeli Committee Against House Demolition, and he's talking about the matrix of control, how sophisticated the occupation is, the architecture and so on, which is so different from the South African experience where things were very clear. So can you maybe both talk about the invisible part of the oppression, how sophisticated it is and how oppressive it is?
You want to start?
Maybe you start.
Okay. Yeah, okay, it's a good question, and I think it's a really important question because we tend to I think it's very common to only think about Palestine or to read about Palestine or see it on TV or in the news when something big happens, like what's happening now, or like what's become an annual bombing of Gaza previously, or we see the more dramatic parts of the occupation, maybe the wall or the bigger checkpoints. And those news stories, come with these narratives about terrorism and Islamophobia and things like that, and so there's no solution to this conflict. But what's really shocking and harder to represent is the kind of structural and everyday and invisible violence that Palestinians live under and that's perpetrated by Israelis. I think something that surprised me the most was that the checkpoint system, which I think it's understood as very innocuous by Israelis. The idea of that, well, if you're a good Palestinian who doesn't have a suicide bomb and you're not guilty of being a terrorist, then why is a checkpoint a problem? They really, really, even among, perhaps they might like to call themselves enlightened Israelis who are anti-occupation, they couldn't understand what is so bad about the checkpoint system. And it's relatively invisible in that it can move around. Like there are permanent checkpoints, and then there are checkpoints there where they will just set it up one morning. There are normally to disrupt people's routes, to go to school, to go to university, particularly around universities actually, or to go to work. And while we often see pictures of people queuing at these permanent checkpoints to go into Israel, these checkpoints tend to happen just between Palestinian spaces. And just the disruption, like I described with this journey, of adding an hour to your journey or preventing you from going to your journey or going to the destination, or to have to walk around for hours in the mud in the winter and, or the rain. I think it's really not understood how much of an impact that has on people's everyday lives. That there's no way to plan this kind of thing. So that's one thing. I think another aspect of invisibility is the culture of surveillance that Palestinians live under, where on the one hand there is a very strong sense there that anything you say, anything you do is being seen by the Israeli occupation, even when you're inside a big Palestinian city and you can't see the wall and you can't see the army and you can't even see these panoptic towers, that your Facebook is under observation, which it is, that your phone can be tapped, that there are conversations you would never have on the phone or using Facebook or anything, that you and even now it's quite difficult to talk to Palestinian friends in the West Bank because at the moment surveillance is heightened and you're not free to say anything that could be deemed as anti-occupation. So conversations are very hard to have with people who are worried about this, right? And the consequences are very real. You can post something, a picture of Yasser Arafat, for example, a friend of mine posted, and the next day the army came to his door and arrested him because Yasser Arafat is anti-occupation. He was the first Palestinian prime minister, but never mind, president. So there's that. Then there's also the culture of informants. So Palestinians are co-opted by the prison industrial complex and infrastructures of Israel, that they are routinely arrested for almost anything, mostly fabricated crimes of trying to exist under occupation, right? Trying to go somewhere or being associated with resistance, and that association can be, your cousin's brother's friend once was a member of Hamas 20 years ago, and that's enough to be arrested. And then once you can be released from prison because you served your time, or you can be released because you have been co-opted to inform on your Palestinian friends and family members to the Israeli authorities. Or you can be threatened into becoming an informant because they might have some information about you, particularly for gay and queer Palestinians. If the Israeli surveillance machine infrastructure finds out, they can use these things against you. They will, out you to your friends and family where it might not be safe for you unless you inform. So people get stuck in these webs, and it creates, perhaps not dissimilar to, Soviet era paranoia about what you can say, who you can trust, and who is listening. So I think that's it was really lasting paranoia that stays with you, especially about being a foreigner, and people don't know who foreigners are, and looking like you can be Israeli, and the presence of also Israelis who come in with American passports or posing as foreigners really make Palestinians quite wary on one hand of not being able to trust people.
I guess, we do speak about settler projects, but at the same time we have to understand that it's a part of a bigger project of demographic engineering. So these settlers, we work with some kind of like implants. So in general, the whole Palestinian demographics is shaped by the settler colonies, and of course it's illegal under the international law. We know that. And at the same time, I think it's necessary also to speak about Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. They also do face the same kind of discrimination. Maybe not the same kind, but they to some extent of discrimination, because even in 2019 the constitution was amended in order to determine that peoples who do have the right of determinations are Jewish people. So there is a discrimination which is following the line not of a citizenship but of ethnicity, which is very interesting. And also I do have some Palestinian friends who are sharing they do hold Israeli passports, and they shared their experience that even in the airports there are some specific I guess serial numbers in their passports that they can distinguish whether you are Palestinian Israeli or Jewish Israeli, and then you have different lines, different queues in the airport, and a different system of checking. So and also I think it's necessary to speak about the Gaza, which is now in focus, and it was surrounded by the fence, but now this fence is opened, and I'm not sure, but I think I heard that some information was leaked about new settlement projects in Gaza, and that the head of settlers, she was speaking that the settlers, they do have a right to see the sea, as they can't afford, of course, the housing which is in Israel, so because of subsidies that they do receive, so they say, okay, so now we have a right to this land in order that we could see the sea. And also, like, speaking about this architecture and infrastructure of occupation, we can also speak from the point of view of political economy, that recently it was also released that already actually before Israel declared the war on Hamas, they already spoke that we do want to develop the gas field, marine gas field, which is next to Gaza, and that already like 6 companies received licenses to develop this gas field. So yeah, so there is much going on that we don't actually grasp on this invisible side of interests, and also infrastructures that are created to complete these interests. It's also like worth mentioning. Okay.
All right, so let's take questions. Well, if you guys have some questions.
What about the invisible aspect being, for instance, the water permits, not only the movement, but also like everyday life? You mentioned that they don't get permission to build roads. They also, as far as I know, don't get permission to dig wells, and I'm sure it extends further.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point actually. The other kind of aim and strategy behind the construction of settlements is to occupy like any colonial occupation, to occupy the resources. So particularly water. I'm not an expert in water because it's a huge kind of industry of settlement, is to control the water and to limit Palestinian water, that they have to buy back their own water at a heavily inflated rate. It's particularly a problem in the Jordan Valley, where most of the Palestinians have been traditionally an agricultural society of farmers. So to take the water causes immediate devastating economic impacts to Palestinians, who have to pay huge amounts for the water to grow their own vegetables, which are then largely sold back to the Israeli market at a poor rate for them. Electricity is similarly another kind of invisible way that Palestinians are controlled, infrastructurally kind of put in a weaker position. And with the same logic that the electricity is controlled by Israel and then sold back to Palestine, always at an inflated price. So Israel, it's important to remember that for the occupation to be sustainable, it has to be profitable for Israel. Beyond construction and beyond war and weapons and military and security, taking the resources of the West Bank, which there are many. It's agriculturally rich and resource-rich area, especially now we've discovered the aim of this Gaza war and the gas fields. It's an interesting conversation to think infrastructurally now, because that's the only way that the occupation can be threatened, right? Is to make it not profitable for Israel to keep doing this, and to also make visible these invisible ways that Palestinians are punished for their indigeneity.
Yeah, it's also the electricity, food is also weaponized now. At the moment in Gaza, we can see how it's used as a weapon. That's also a kind of profit.
So talking about profits, one of the differences that are being made between Palestine and South Africa is the South Africans needed the white settlers. They needed Africans to build the country and so on. And it seems like, for Palestine, they don't need Palestinians. Yet they have to go to work. People from Gaza, they go to work in Israel, and people from West Bank. So how do they deal with this contradiction?
Yeah, I don't know if it's been, I imagine it's been somewhat deliberate actually, that until about the second Intifada, so around 2000, Israel was completely reliant on Palestinian labor to build it, right? It's a new country, you have to build it. And they are still, for the most part, dependent on Palestinian labor. Why? Because it's cheap, you can pay Palestinians less. They will work without kind of social security payments, pensions, things like that. They will work cash in hand for less illegally, but it's tolerated. They are the kind of migrant laborers of Israel, right? Since the second Intifada, there's been more of a push to reduce reliance on Palestinians by importing laborers from other countries, particularly in the field of care work for nursing and old people, from South Asia, from the Philippines, from Thailand. I think this was brought to light because one of the hostages taken was Thai, right? And to replace Palestinians with another class. Unfortunately, the wider political kind of environment that is in Israel and Palestine, and that Israel creates for itself, is that these workers don't want to come, and they will leave during times of war. So now there is the issue of the Israelis do not allow the Palestinians. They've lost all of their Gazan laborers. About 10,000 were coming every day from Gaza to work inside Israel. About 60,000, I think, come from the West Bank every day into Israel, and we don't have an estimate. Those are the ones who are legally permitted to come. The illegal ones, it's harder to guess, but I think it's another 20 to 40,000. And they mostly work in the farms. So immediately there's a labor shortage in Israel for their own agricultural production, which is bad anyway, but bad in a time of war. Yes, and I think we saw in the news recently there was an effort to replace the foreign laborers with the right-wing president of India, with Modi, who was offering to, there was this kind of agreement to bring 100,000 Indian workers. I don't think they were successful. But also that logic speaks to something else that's very ingrained in Israeli society, which is this idea of population exchange. That was the kind of original aim of the 1948 of the Nakba, was to bring the Arab Jews from the Middle Eastern countries and send the Palestinians back to those countries, which is maybe a nice, neat political idea, but doesn't work in practice, right? But that population exchanges and the kind of bringing in of people, particularly as temporary laborers and particularly as people who know they will be working at really in a disadvantaged system and way, is now proving a bit more unsuccessful for Israel, which is quite interesting to see.
So for me, I'm not sure if you haven't counted, but we always read about that. Okay, some of the settlements are legal, but some of them are also illegal. So, have you observed any kind of these kind of settlements? Because the Israeli government, they do have an obligation to safeguard these illegal settlements as well. So are they still present, or?
Yes. It's hard to talk about it in English because the language that we use in English to talk about illegal settlement is not the same as the Hebrew or the Israeli way of describing it. New settlements, they're actually they use infrastructure to kind of make a settlement, but it all happens retrospectively. But generally, what you get among settlers is perhaps some. Already we're talking about people who tend to sit towards the far right or the extreme far right. You get the more far right ones who are interested and motivated to occupy more land. They want to take more land. And so they are kind of permitted or encouraged or allowed to go. And all settlers are armed, particularly these guys, right? They're allowed to carry weapons, and they do. And they see Palestinians as an enemy. So they will go, they will start a camp. That's how the settlement I was working in was founded. There were 7 hills, and gradually they would go and they would set up a camp on the 2nd hill. Anywhere that a Jewish Israeli is, the Israeli army is obliged to protect them. So if there are Israelis in a risky situation of being, exposed on this Palestinian land that they're claiming, then the soldiers will come and protect them. They will stay a couple of months. They normally do it in the spring or the autumn. After a while, somebody brings some children, or even some children are born. And by then you need a school, and you need water, and you need electricity, and you need some shelters. And so when these are kind of put in place, and by then it becomes a town. So you see A.L. Wiseman in this book, Hollow Land, talks very nicely about how this process is it's all done in coordination with the local army generals who are in charge of the security for the area. And it's also all done increasingly with the cooperation of property development companies. So from tents, you get these kind of container houses, metal ones. And then eventually it will become earmarked for to build houses on. And it's become lucrative for both these construction development, property development companies, but also for the children of settlers who are particularly motivated to stay in settlements. But there is a waiting list for housing in Israel, and they are increasingly only building in settlements. And it's a nice place to live, right? Because it's a new house, it's new infrastructure, it's new schools. Everything is nice and clean and new compared to the stuff from, the 50s and the 60s inside Israel. And they're bigger, you can have a nice middle-class life there. So people are really motivated to take part in the settlement process. But the other way is, of course, through infrastructure. So you need things like phone masts around the West Bank for the settlers to use on the Israeli phone networks. Once there is a phone mast, the phone mast needs a guard. Once there is a guard, maybe he brings his wife, you see? And then so slowly things become settlements. So infrastructure is really weaponized as a way of expanding the state in these, it starts with something invisible like a phone signal, and then it becomes a new town 5-6 years later.
How would you compare and contrast the architectures of occupation and then the kind of subjectivities and outlooks of the people that live in these architectures between the kibbutz and the kind of West Bank settlement? Because as I understood, the kibbutz had its own kind of history, and kind of it attracts still certain people. I don't know, I heard in the news over the last months there's still some kind of peace activists, or even somebody who described themselves as leftist, and this kind of thing. So I understand there's slightly different dynamics between.
Do you have anything to add to this before I go?
No, please.
Okay. You're on focus. Okay. I don't know. I'm not a kibbutz expert, so I'm sorry I can't give you too much information. But what I understand about the kibbutz is that there are very few that are kind of still true to the original, very, very communistic model, right? That they're where the kind of childcare is shared, and they're economically self-sufficient. These days they tend to take more of a capitalistic approach. That the majority are perhaps farming communities is a better way to describe it, where they all share labor on the land, but quite often that labor is still hired or outsourced to others. But kibbutz and settlement are not like mutually exclusive. That actually in the settlement block that I was working in, there was a kibbutz there. So it's maybe easier to describe it as a communal agricultural production. The one that I'm talking about, it's in a block called Gush Etzion. It's just south of Jerusalem. Produced like artisanal wine, West Bank wine. So you have to be careful when you buy your wine. Because they sell it in Lithuania, I've seen it, so be careful. And they're also very much used for tourism, particularly in the West Bank, to kind of, one of the other kind of aesthetic things about the settlements is that they're not, you shouldn't be able to visually notice that you're not in historic Palestine or in Israel. It's designed to be as smooth a transition as possible, hence the decision to use this kind of stone cladding that is also used inside Jerusalem city and inside Israel. There is no sign saying now you're in the West Bank. It's very intentional, right? So the kibbutzes are often used particularly for, this birthright and for this idea of Jewish citizens of the world coming home to Israel. They're taken there to be shown how Israel's presence in the West Bank is just like Israel's presence in Tel Aviv or in Haifa or in the Negev in the south, it's likely the plan for Gaza as well, for the Gaza settlements that they're planning. It's interesting the way the Palestinians talk about it, particularly the agricultural settlements in the West Bank, is that how can these, they're quite funny about it, and they say, how can these Israelis grow wine and call it Israeli Jewish wine when it's a Palestinian grape that our grandfathers planted 10 generations ago? Don't they understand that? Or of course the other alternative is they pull up all the Palestinian, these really ancient grapes that have been growing there, you can imagine, for centuries, and plant something new. I don't know if that answered your question very well.
I've got a question
Go.
about the there are most probably different styles of settlements and subcultures that's all these things, but is there a generic tendency who ethnic, not ethnically, but what is the background of settlers? Are they people coming from really abroad that are promised the wonderful lands in a nice house, or where, what is the social groups basically? Ignorant, nothing. I mean, if one can say so, or it's super diverse.
It's a really good question. It's actually, on one hand, you can divide them into political and economic settlers. So there are the ones who they want to settle, they want to cross the green line, they want to take part in this new part of the Israeli state. And then more increasingly, you have economic settlers. So most of the settlers I met said, I'm not political, I don't care about politics, I just, after you have 4 kids, you need a bigger house. And so you move out to the settlements because that's the only place you can have a bigger house. And it's frightening or troubling, I guess, that they don't see it as political. But that's how it's marketed. It's just nice new housing in a nice new suburb. But within then that, the settlements are quite diverse in that they tend to be, so if you imagine, most of them are small towns or large villages of between a couple of hundred, or the settlement I worked in, Efrat, was 20,000 and it was a city. They're grouped by language community because they have the option to organize themselves, and so English, the Efrat city settlement where I was is primarily Anglophone, so English speaking Israelis or people who have migrated from elsewhere, so particularly Americans, South Africans, British, Australians as well. Across the road we had the Spanish speaking, so Jews from Latin America came there. There is a very big city settlement in the center of the West Bank called Ariel. It's where the first settlement university was opened. That is exclusively home to Jews from the former Soviet Union and they were all put there in the early 90s because they were coming in large numbers after the fall of the Soviet Union, and nobody wanted to live in this settlement because it wasn't finished yet, it wasn't very nice. So they just put them all there. Israel can really direct where it puts people, in the same way that it puts the Arab Jews when they arrived in the north and in the south and in the borders and the less nice parts of the country. There was also, I don't know how much you all know about the city of Hebron, but it's a very big Palestinian city with a very small and very aggressive settler population in it. And they've built an additional settlement next to it called Kiryat Arba, which is home to the rumor. I mean, this is, okay, bear with me because I was told a number of rumors. It's considered a bad settlement. It's home to people associated with crime, to low-income migrants, particularly from Latin America. So Latin American Jews who don't come to invest in Israel in the way that they want. They come because it's the only economic option for them. And to more Russian Jews who are treated often with a lot of suspicion by other Israeli Jewish people because it's debatable whether they actually are Jewish or not, or whether they were just trying to get out of Russia in the 90s. And there are rumors that they're celebrating Christmas and that you can buy pork there and things like that. So settlements come with lots of because of this grouping around language particularly, or socioeconomic status. Then there are, the last category is ultra-Orthodox settlements for the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, who live a little bit outside of the rest of modern society. They only marry within their very religious community, and they keep very strict religious laws, like they don't use the internet, they don't watch TV, the men don't go in the army, they mostly study, and so they are also one of the fastest growing demographics in Israel because they have a lot of kids. So they live in two neighborhoods in Jerusalem and another city inside Israel, but they expand so rapidly that now they are being put in settlements as well that are kind of closed to the outside world. So there was one of those very close to where I lived, very close to Bethlehem, and it's interesting because it's kind of apolitical. They don't take part in the kind of occupation part of the state, but then they very much do by living there and by also being put in these settlements. So you can see there's quite a lot of manipulation by the Israeli state and the settlement enterprise of how they can get people into the settlement.
Do we involve between each other these different settlements with different identities? Do we have tensions, or they are very sustainable? They can live separately and not sit, not necessary to engage with each other?
It depends. So it's not every settlement has a school, and things like health clinics. There isn't one in every settlement because there's still, the city settlement where I work. There was 3 schools. But if you wanted your kids to go to a different kind of school, you would send them to another settlement, or there is a mall for all of the settlements around. So generally there is this identity that we are all settlers, and politically they're not homogenous, but they tend to be vote within the settler political parties. They've got much more political power in the past 10 years. But yeah, generally there's this sense of being a community. Actually, while I was there, there was a very rare event, which was a settler evacuation, which happens incredibly rarely, where Peace Now, an Israeli organization, takes the settlements to court about the legal occupation, the illegal use of the land. And they managed to win a case of an area that was about the size of 10 houses in the middle of a settlement. They won, the Israeli High Court ruled that land did belong to a Palestinian, and so the settlers there had to be evacuated. And I guess every now and again they let one of these court cases win, but they let the most ridiculous one win, because can you imagine a Palestinian farmer trying to farm this island inside of a settlement, and the settlers are very angry. And so the time came for the evacuation, and it was, at the time there were about 650,000 settlers in the West Bank in total, and they all came to protest. And the settlers refused, when these things happen, they refuse to leave the house. The army have to take them from the house, and they have these kind of funerals for the space of the settlement, and it's referred to in this language of trauma and eviction and really evoking memories of the Holocaust and things like that. So it's a very emotional, sad time for them, and they are kind of it's also a space for the Jewish settler youth, especially the more far right ones, to kind of be together and to stir up a lot of feelings about it. And so it was an interesting time to be there when I was working there, that this was happening and they were coming in buses every day, and there was this real sense of settlers against the Israeli state, that we're not being protected by our state.
So there are organizations that are against this settlement policy, of course, but demographically, is this a big part of?
No,
Just
I
a few
think
percent.
there's two. Sorry.
Yeah, it's,
There's two main ones. There's Peace Now, they deal particularly with settlements, and then there's B'Tselem, who deal particularly with Palestinian rights at checkpoints. So they have like human rights kind of monitors at checkpoints. Now I imagine there's more. They're growing. Of what's going on, but yeah.
you want to comment on it?
No, I just had one more question. How would you feel like? What were like the opinions of the Palestinians in the West Bank? Do they hope still for the two-state solution, or like it's, or maybe they are for one-state solution? What do they speak in general about these different solutions that might occur?
It's a good question. I wouldn't want to like homogenize, I guess, Palestinians by saying either one or two. I think on the one hand, Palestinians are really raised with this idea of the importance of having their state, and in a sense they got a semblance of a state after the Oslo Accords in '94. But they've seen what kind of state this produces. They also then have the issue of the fragmentation of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem and inside Israel and the refugees. So it's very difficult to conceive of what would be best for all of them, two or one state. And because of the fragmentation, I don't know, I think people find it difficult to imagine where is the state of Palestine. It's kind of, it also would have to go over and under and around, all of these obstacles. Mostly, I mean, I'm very aware that people were saying things to me, as an outsider and as a Westerner who's going to go away and write a book about them. But what people wanted was just not to be occupied. That was the main thing. I think that came really above two or one states, was just to be able to have some freedom. Yeah.
I'd like to get back to what you said about the diversity of settlers. One, the information that I got from that anthropologists in Israel, many of them, at least in the beginning or in the 90s, they are criminals, actually. They come from American prisons, and it's actually something that is very common in settler colonialism ideology, to populate the areas with real criminals taken from prisons. And that's why you can see as well some the most vicious settlers in Hebron, for example. And I just found it so terrifying because we could see some of them and what they have done, just unbelievable. So it made all sense to me, and also this ideology was applied in South Africa, but also in Australia, just to control the natives. And my question is, looking at where I'm from, it's also a colonial space, used to be. The occupation has transformed and redefined spaces for women and other minorities. So I was wondering how this is played out in Palestine, because some also academics talk about social side, because the infrastructures are made in so that the life of Palestinians become unbearable so that they leave. So how concretely it is transforming social relationship?
That's a good question. Actually, something that I found really sad was that most Palestinians, there's this real asymmetry, right, between how Israelis understand Palestine and how Palestinians understand Israel. And until particularly the older Palestinians who worked and lived before the wall, and that was put up around 2000 to 2005, they worked inside Israel, they could go freely inside Israel, they could, a lot of them had, depending on which industry you were in, so a very good friend of mine, they have always been, like, their family is car mechanics. And before the wall, they would go and repair cars and work in garages inside Israel. No problem, you could go every day. And they would work with the Arab Jews, who are the Jews who came from the Middle Eastern countries and Iran and North Africa. And they spoke Arabic. And they practiced, they're called Mizrahim, it means Oriental. It's not a particularly nice term, I guess, the Hebrew term. But they spoke Arabic, and their way of practicing Judaism is very close to, they have, a lot of Arab cultures and traditions. So it's naturally Palestinians could communicate with them and got into business with them and work together. And so, they would come and eat together and do a lot of things together. There wasn't this like fear and segregation that you have now. So a lot of Palestinian friends who worked in Israel, said it's a shame, we used to have coffee and tea with these people. We, sometimes they still even call each other on the phone and say, Happy New Year or happy, whichever religious holiday they're calling about, say happy this one. And that's really not possible now, not an option, at least for Palestinians in Gaza at the West Bank who are living in this enclosure. Then there's so Palestinians also know a lot about Israelis, and they also, most of them speak a bit of Hebrew. They don't learn Hebrew in school, but they speak a bit because they have to deal with, the soldiers or the military administration or their Israeli employers. And they understand. I was always very surprised that Palestinians were very polite at the checkpoints, but of course the power dynamics is that you should be you don't want to appear as a threat, right? So they smile and wave and say some nice words in Hebrew as they go past because they don't want to be interpreted as, threatening terrorist or give the soldiers additional reason to create a problem for them. So there's this kind of subjection to obeying your colonial master and to behaving or being disciplined in the eyes of Israelis. Whereas the Israelis, on the other hand, the ones I met, and particularly the settlers who have come to the West Bank to live really close to Palestinians, don't know anything about Palestine. They use the words, Arab, Palestinian, Muslim, terrorist interchangeably. All those words mean the same thing. And there's no sense that Palestinians are, a diverse group, that there are Christian Palestinians. The level of propaganda and information controlled towards Israelis is terrifyingly strong. They, I would talk to Israelis and say, what do you think about Palestinians? And they would say, oh, well, they grow up learning to kill Jews. That's all they learn. They go to school, they learn to kill Jews. And you think, it's not only not realistic, but how can you, like I said, this is a kind of cognitive dissonance about Palestinians as a kind of heterogeneous and people as opposed to kind of entity or thing is really absent from Israeli society. So I think that's very sad because it doesn't help solving the problem, but there's also some very small initiatives to put Palestinians and Israelis in the same room together, particularly those who have lost children to the crimes of the occupation and then the crimes of Palestinian resistance. Those are probably some of the only times that Israelis will meet Palestinians and meet with them as equals, right? And sit at the same table as them, where efforts are made to reduce the power dynamic. But these efforts are quite controversial for both sides, right? For Palestinians, it's quite controversial to go and join these groups. Some people do it, but it's considered normalization of the Israeli presence. And for Israelis, I met one settler woman who took part in these groups. She had lost her son to a suicide bombing, and she got hate mail and threatened by her settler neighbors for taking part. So there's this desire to keep this asymmetry among Israelis that I think is something that has to be undone now, where really there is a big movement to separate Judaism from Zionism that we haven't seen maybe since the Second Intifada, but now it's particularly in America. It's in at least in the UK. I don't know too much about the other European countries, but there is a very careful and very vocal movement among young Jewish people, or Jewish people in general, maybe not just young ones, to make a distinction and to make it very clear that Israel is not acting in their name, and they also hold a lot of power politically.
All right. Anyone has a last question?
How's the rise of like a multipolar world where we're seeing the rise of China, for instance, and somehow fading of the U.S. Influence, how can that affect the colonization project?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess we should fear Chinese colonization as much as we fear any colonization. I know it's happening in a not particularly equitable way in sub-Saharan Africa, right? I mean, I find the Chinese support of Palestine to be fairly fickle. I haven't been particularly interested before. It's coming with these bizarre new geopolitical lines of China and Putin aligned with Hamas, and somehow, you know, everything has gotten a bit mixed up. On the other hand, it could be incredibly economically beneficial for Palestinians, right? And there is also a very old socialist alliance between the socialist Palestinian parties and China and the former Soviet Union. So there are historic links there. Yeah, I don't know too much enough to comment on that actually, but it's a good question.
China is much different, like superpower than the United States is. They even like if we look at the recent developments in the region, they asked, like, for example, Iran and Saudi Arabia to sign some agreement. So these two countries are like severe enemies. They are having something like a Cold War in the region, but still they managed now to make some agreements just because of the China influence. As China's aim, they do say that they don't care actually about the inner policies of the states. They just care that that would be secure space for the trading. So they just want, they are like looking for the security and whatever it takes to get to the security. So that's a totally different attitude from United States attitude, who is like who was operating more like a policeman, like getting involved in the internal affairs and trying to regulate them, though it won't work in several cases.
Yes, okay.
My
Two last-
handle
Okay, sorry.
like behind you.
Sorry.
I guess it kind of what you were saying about China and also economic gain and kind of the way the powers are restructuring now in terms of trade, and now Houthis in Yemen also coming into play for that. And I wonder, I mean, it's kind of like sidetracking to perhaps quite far from like the original research or topic where we were talking about more broadly into geopolitical kind of economic relationships, but that seems to be also becoming quite an important player, and also Saudi Arabia sort of saying that also they're not going to like join in this coalition of states that are going to protect the Red Sea from the Houthis attack. So I wonder if that's kind of going to also influence and yeah, I guess like Palestinian. What would you say? The China's kind of also involvement in this.
I guess this conflict is both beneficial, both problematic for many of the regional countries. It's kind of like we talked so much about Iran being having their interest in the chaos that is created in that region, but many of the Arab countries are also like benefiting from this conflict. But at the same time, of course, like there is a problematic issue now with Houthis, but I'm not sure, like because Saudi Arabia and other Arab Emirates are there in Yemen, so I guess we're going to control this problem. But I'm not sure what was your point. Like, do you think about?
I guess is there an influence that they might have in the broader economic relationships between the countries that might influence then the Palestinian state or state of freedom or occupation?
Well, I'm not sure.
You're referring to
There are so many-
this axis of resistance that was created.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
blocking of the ships and kind of attack of the ships, and that is kind of having an impact, a huge impact in like UK, US, and European Union.
it's very significant that about 2 hours after they occupied one of the ships, maybe 2 weeks ago. About 2 hours after it was announced, the British Prime Minister suddenly announced we actually have to start talking about ceasefire, right? So at the same time, there is, this. Forgive me for being maybe a bit romantic, but I think it's one of the positive things to have come out of this is to perhaps reignite our faith in resistance movements, right? That's both Hamas, who are, fighting against the most catastrophic odds, and the Houthis, again, also fighting against, admittedly quite well funded, but fighting against, Saudi and the other half of Yemen, are able to make such big political impacts. I think that's quite inspiring. And it's worth holding on to something positive, right?
But also it's quite a big question if the Israeli government at the moment, if they do still listen to United States or any other parties, or do they already moving forward without even without support? It's also not
Can
clear.
they move without any support?
Um,
Or could they?
For 3 days.
it's not clear. It's a big question whether they are so dependent or not. And even if United States votes differently or they withdraw the veto rights, if it change anything or not, it's still a discussion.
All right, I think we're closing up. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming, for accepting this last minute invitation. Thank you all for coming.